So here we have to discuss the first picture. We have a nose, mouth, epiglottis. But actually, the nose and epiglottis are part of your gastrointestinal tract. However, they only have one pathway so that they belong to the respiratory system. Then, we have the pharynx, larynx, trachea, and you just have to note that larynx is part of the respiratory system, while the epiglottis is part of digestive system. They are located just beside each other, and when one closes, other one opens, or vice versa. For example, if you swallow your food, the epiglottis open and the larynx closes. That is because the larynx is the entry for your respiratory system, and epiglottis is entry port for gastrointestinal tract. In your lungs, we have here your bronchus. It is a root-like structure of your lungs, and then bronchus branches out into smaller root-like structure called your bronchioles. The bronchiole is vasculated and it is a vein, artery, and capillary. In connection into your cardiovascular system, the vein carries the oxygenated blood and artery carries oxygenated blood. But this is not the case in respiratory system because it is actually the opposite. Because veins carries oxygenated blood while arteries carry the oxygenated blood. The reason of that because of gas exchange. As you can see, your bronchioles forms a grape-like structures. This is your alveoli, where gas exchange takes place. When you inhale, the oxygen is actually trapped in alveoli and then they diffuse out and enter capillary, and carbon dioxide diffuses out of the capillary and enter your alveoli so that it can travel all the way out in your respiratory system during exhalation. So this is the short overview of our respiratory system. So here in the second diagram, it shows the different mucosa or the epithelia composing your respiratory system. Here in your nasal area, you have respiratory mucosa with mucosal. In pharynx or larynx area, it is made of stratified squamous epithelium. And then in your trachea, you have respiratory mucosa cells. And your bronchi here is made up of cuboidal epithelium. And your alveoli is made up of simple squamous epithelium. So this is the different epithelial lining. Next, let's go to the different epithelium. First, we have the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. So we all know that the respiratory system is lined with the cells with respiratory system and lined with special accessory organelle, which is the cilia. So cilia is responsible for propelling out all of the antigenic or foreign entities that have entered the body through respiration or through breathing. In line with the nasal cavity, paranasal sinuses, nasopharynx, trachea, inferior portion of the larynx, the main bronchi, and the lobar bronchi. Next, we have the simple ciliated columnar epithelium, lines the segmental bronchi, smaller bronchi, and large bronchioles. Simple ciliated columnar epithelium lines the terminal and respiratory bronchioles, while the simple squamous epithelium forms both the alveolar duct and the alveoli. So here in the overview, your respiratory tract consists of paired lungs and series of air passages that branch into increasingly smaller tubules called alveoli. So the alveoli are the functional unit of your lungs. And there are three principal functions of your lungs, which are the air conduction, air filtration, and the gas exchange or the respiration. So in gas exchange, it is facilitated by respiration. Then respiration is a medical term for breathing. This respiration occurs primarily on your alveoli. So the air passing through the larynx used to produce speech. So the air that passes through your larynx causes vibration in that area, and it is the mechanism behind your speech. Aside from that, the air passes through your Olfactory mucosa, which is located in the nasal cavity, carry the stimuli for the sense of smell. In embryonic development, lungs actually develop as a ventral evagination. So when you say evagination, it is turning inside out. The lining of the foregut located in the developing fetus turn upside down, and that particular development will result into the formation of your lungs. That is also why your respiratory epithelium is said to be in the thermal origin. So the respiratory diverticulum grows into the thoracic mesenchyme. So what do you mean by respiratory diverculum? It is the embryological endoderm structures that develops into the respiratory tract organs. The bronchial cartilages, the smooth muscle, and the other connective tissues are derived from the thoracic mesenchyme. So, after the development of the lungs, the cartilages of the blood vessels, the smooth muscle, skeletal muscle, and the other connective tissue that protects and surround your lungs or completes your lungs will develop from the thoracic mesenchyme. The lungs itself derive from the ventral evagination, while the other organs are derived from thoracic mesenchyme. Let's discuss the different principles of your lungs. So first, let's focus on the conducting portion of your lungs. It consists of air passages. So what are the air passages? We call it the alveoli. It leads to the side of respiration within the lungs where gas exchange takes place. So when you say air conduction, it is conducting of the air. This is where air conditioning occur. What do you mean by that? We warm the air, we moisten the air, and we remove the particulate matter that be present in the air. In the air conditioning portion is responsible or as a mechanism for mucus and serous secretion. So the serous is a fluid located at the outer covering layers of the lungs or the pleural fluid. Pleural fluid serves as the lubricant when you exhale and inhale, can't have any friction between that part of your lungs. Mucus is responsible for trapping and removal of particulate matter. Also in air conducting portion includes trapping particles that slip past the vibrissae, the hair inside our nose. It is filters the air that enter the respiratory system. However, there are particles that can pass through and they are trapped in the vibrissae. Now, let's discuss the nasal passages. So, here in nasal cavities, it represents the two large air-filled spaces in the uppermost part of the respiratory system. It also covers the oral cavity. So, in oral cavity, it resides inferior to the nasal cavity is only apparent during the forced breathing. In nasopharynx, lies between the nasal cavities, communicates inferiorly with the oropharynx. So, oropharynx located posterior to the oral cavity. Then larynx, a hollow tubular organ, contains cartilaginous framework responsible for producing the sounds. Then next is trachea, the flexible air tube extends from the larynx to the thorax. It conduit for air. Then in the mediastinum, it bifurcates into paired main bronchi. Paired main bronchi or the primary bronchi enters root of the right or left lung, undergo extensive branching to produce bronchioles. It is the terminal part of the conducting passages. So note, the internal bronchi plus the bronchioles equals to bronchial 3. Now let's go to the respiratory portion. Again, where gas exchange occurs. When you say respiratory portion, usually cover the primarily alveoli. It includes respiratory bronchioles, the alveolar duct, alveolar sac, and alveoli itself. For the respiratory bronchioles involve both air conduction and gas exchange. In alveolar ducts, which is elongated airways, form from the confluence openings to alveoli. Alveoli sacs to represent spaces surrounded by clusters of alveoli. Alveoli, which is the primary site of gas exchange. Then, what do you mean by gas exchange? When you inhale, you introduce oxygen. Then, when you exhale, you expel out carbon dioxide. So, let's go now to the nasal cavity. So, when you say nasal cavity, it is paired chambers separated by a bony and cartilaginous septum. So, we all know that this part here, in our nose, it is not made of a solid rigid bone, but a cartilage. So for the skeletal framework, it is formed by bones and cartilages, mostly located centrally in the skull. So it communicates with the external environment through the anterior nares or the nostrils. So the nasal cavity communicates with the outside environment through the nasal nares. So the nasal cavity is divided into three regions: the nasal vestibule, the respiratory region, and the medial wall. So first, let's discuss about the nasal vestibule. It is dilated space of the nasal cavity, includes the nostrils. So it lined with a stratified squamous epithelium, and it has a sebaceous gland that produces sebum. Sebum is a form of oil. The purpose of this sebum is to entrap the particulate matter or to entrap any dirty foreign substances that may enter your nasal cavity and into your respiratory system. Next, we have your respiratory region, which is the largest part of the nasal cavity, about 2/3. It's lined with the respiratory mucosa. It constitutes most of the volume of the nasal cavities. And last, we have the medial wall, which is called your nasal septum. It increases the surface area. So the surface area is actually important in a person's sense of smell, because the higher the surface area, the higher the sense of smell. It causes turbulence in airflow to allow more efficient conditioning of inspired air. Next, we have the respiratory mucosa. So first, let's discuss about the picture here. So when you say mucosa, this is like the epithelia of your respiratory system. So here, this is your cilia. It is a feathery edge. Your goblet cells that is responsible for the production of your mucus. The nucleus of the columnar cells, it is the cells that lines in your respiratory mucosa and is your columnar epithelial cells. Your lamina propria, it is the structure beneath your basal lamina and responsible for supplying nutrients to maintain cell viability in your respiratory mucosa. Respiratory mucosa is composed of 5 cells: the ciliated cells, the goblet cells, the brush cells, the small granule cells or the Kolchitsky cells, and the basal cells. So first, let's discuss the ciliated cells. So it is a tall columnar cells with cilia, and it covers the surface of the epithelium. Next, we have the goblet cells, which synthesize and secretes mucus. Next, we have the brush cells, the general name for those cells in the respiratory tract that bear short, blunt microvilli. Next, we have the small granule cells or the Kolchitsky cells. Resembles basal cells and it contains secretory granules. Last, we have the basal cells that made up of stem cells, or stem cell is where other cell types arise. The mucosa of the respiratory region warms, moistens, and filters inspired air. So in paranasal sinuses, air-filled spaces in the bones of the walls of the nasal cavity. It is the extension of the respiratory region, and sinuses are named for the bones in which they are found, like ethmoid, frontal, sphenoid, and maxillary bones.